Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. The regional economies in Southeast Michigan and Ontario are bracing for some severe disruptions today. President Trump enacted 25% tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, with Canadian energy products subject to a 10% import tax. Ontario Premier Doug Ford says he will cut off electricity exports to the U.S. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said his country would respond with tariffs on more than $100 billion of American goods over the course of 21 days. And the 10% tariff that Trump placed on Chinese imports last month was doubled to 20%. China retaliated with additional tariffs on U.S. farm exports. But what exactly are tariffs, and how do they affect everyday people?
Yes, Tia, that is the question, and one that we will be answering and exploring a lot more over the coming days. Senior producer David Lyons spoke with Bharat Ramamurti. He's a senior advisor for economic strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project and former economic communications advisor for the Biden-Harris administration. He explained what tariffs are and reflected on how tariffs will affect the U.S. economy going forward.
Can you give me a chalkboard definition of what tariffs are?
Yes, a tariff is a tax on imports. And so the best way to think about it is if you are a company and you are importing a good from Canada or from Mexico or from China, and it costs a certain amount of money, a 10% tariff on that item would mean that you will pay 10% of the cost of importing that item as a tax to the federal government.
That's a cost that has to get passed on to a consumer through the company that's selling it to them. Is that right?
Right. So the first step is the company pays a certain amount of a tax on the import that it brings in. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, what does the company do with that additional cost, right? If you think about it, there's a few different alternatives, right? Alternative one is that the company says, that additional tax on a good from a foreign country makes that item so much more expensive that we're not going to buy it anymore. Instead, what we're going to do is look for alternatives from other countries or from the United States, right? And that, in many ways, is the intended effect of a tariff, right? The point of a tariff, in many ways, is to discourage the import of that good and force the company in the United States to look for alternatives that may be produced domestically. Now, the issue is that companies can't just do that at the drop of a hat, right? If you're a manufacturing company that relies on certain products from China to manufacture the good that you produce, it's not very easy to just say a week later, oh, I can find an alternative for that that's produced in the United States or produced in some other country. So in that instance, you may just end up swallowing that additional 10% cost. And then, more likely than not, that additional cost will be passed along to the consumer at the end of the day, because a lot of businesses can't afford to just absorb that additional cost. The alternative, of course, is that you look for options that are not from that foreign country. Now, again, there may not be pre-existing options in the United States to fill that need. Or if you think about it from an economic perspective, if you are an American company that makes that product and now your competitor has additional 10% tax on the product that it's bringing in, your logical move is going to be to raise your own prices because you can't, knowing that your competitors' prices have gone up. So that means that basically in either event, either if the company brings in the good from China or some foreign country or finds a local alternative, the prices are going to go up. That's just basic economics.
Mm-hmm. With the active tariff right now, a 10% tariff that the U.S. has placed on Chinese goods and the retaliatory 15% tariff on U.S. goods imported to China, what are the industries that are going to be most affected? Where are we going to see that there isn't an alternative for U.S. consumers to shift where we're purchasing our goods from?
A lot of the goods that come in from China are go into manufacturing processes in the United States. So there's electronics products, there's computer products that come from China. Some of them are end products. It's a item that you actually go and buy on the shelf. But more often than not, it's something that goes into a bigger manufacturing process in the United States, and then it results in an appliance or a television or something that you're used to going to the store and buying. The truth of the matter is that given the scope of Chinese manufacturing in particular, it's often hard for companies to find alternatives to the Chinese option. And oftentimes those alternatives, if they exist, are going to be much more expensive than the Chinese option. So the short-term impact of these tariffs on China are going to be, there's no way around it, an increase in costs that American consumers face on a wide variety of goods.
And is there a long-term benefit where the tariffs will help the United States get our other industries going? I'm thinking about the CHIPS Act that was enacted by President Biden and trying to build up this chips industry in the U.S. so we can really produce them domestically and not depend on China for so many things that, like you said, they just manufacture so much stuff that we use in our economy. Is there a long-term benefit there, and how do we get to that point? How long does that kind of thing take to shape up?
Yeah, absolutely. Tariffs can be used for strategic purposes, but I think it's important to distinguish between a targeted tariff on a particular industry or set of goods and the across-the-board tariff that the Trump administration is implementing. You know, in the Biden administration, we put tariffs on certain steel and aluminum products that were coming from abroad, and for certain microchips and other things where we felt like it was extremely important for both economic and national security reasons that we have a thriving American industry in that area. And by contrast, with this across-the-board tariff, it's harder to see any strategic purpose. You know, it may be the case that we want to become less dependent on Chinese manufacturing. I think that's a good thing. But the idea of completely detaching ourselves from China also carries risks with it. And we should think carefully about whether there is some sort of higher economic or national security purpose to avoiding bringing in cheap textiles or cheap minor electronic products from China, rather than trying to develop a local industry. The other thing is that oftentimes you have to pair that tariff with federal government support for bringing that industry back to the United States. You know, we saw that, like you said, with the CHIPS Act. There were tariffs and restrictions on imports from foreign countries, but at the same time, a big federal investment in making sure that we could develop a thriving local industry for building those types of, very important products. The Trump administration isn't pairing these tariffs with any sort of domestic investment. So what will happen is that no domestic industry arises to take the place of the imports that we're making more expensive from China. And the net effect of that, both the short term and the long term, is simply higher prices for American companies and American consumers.
Mm-hmm. Higher prices for Americans, and that's in the short term, and maybe in the medium term as well, depending on how those industries react. You're listening to the Metro on Detroit Public Radio. I'm David Lyons, and I'm speaking with Bharat Ramamurti, Senior Advisor for Economic Strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project. You mentioned using tariffs strategically and often paired with government policy and support to build up industries, but what about using tariffs as negotiating tactics and as levers of power to achieve other means? How have tariffs been used in the past as a negotiating tactic for something that wasn't necessarily an economic or industrial objective?
Look, America is a very attractive consumer market, and companies from all across the world want to get into the American market and access American consumers. And that is leverage that we can exert in the world. And one of the reasons that Congress has authorized the president to use tariffs is to protect national security. So tariffs are a really flexible, potentially powerful tool, but they carry with them very clear costs. Right? They almost certainly will lead to increases in prices for Americans. That's how they work, right? The whole point is by imposing and making imported goods more expensive, that will either help domestic industry or discourage Americans from buying that product altogether. That's the theory of tariffs. And so can they be used strategically to help with certain national security and economic goals? Yes, we did that in the Biden administration. Does it really make sense to be imposing across-the-board tariffs on some of our closest trading partners like Canada and Mexico, where we're generally allies with them on a wide variety of issues. I don't really see the case for that. And I think that's in part why the Trump announcement didn't really lead to any serious concessions from either Canada or Mexico.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it raises the question for me about the relationship between Canada, Mexico, and the United States economically and with our manufacturing. Here in Detroit and Southeast Michigan, so much of our local economy is parts and manufacturing that goes across the border multiple times. How does that affect on a long-term scale businesses that are run either in the United States or in Canada that rely on these manufacturing relationships with companies that are across the border? Is there a destabilizing effect is what I'm asking for these particular companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think destabilizing is a good word. Uncertainty is another word that you hear about a lot. And I just want to take an example. Imagine that you are a home builder here in the United States. We've got a real housing shortage in the United States. It's important that home builders put money behind building lots of new housing across the United States. Well, if you rely on lumber that comes from Canada and other products for the house that come from Mexico, and you're not sure whether your costs are going to be 10, 15, 20% higher because of potential tariffs, are you really going to decide to put a lot of money into new construction until you have more certainty about all of that, right? So what ends up happening is companies stay on the sidelines. Businesses decide not to make big capital investments because there's so much uncertainty about what their costs are going to be. Even if these tariffs are announced and then ultimately taken down very quickly or not even put in place because of an agreement that's reached between the countries, it's very hard for businesses in that environment to make long-term decisions. And that's going to have real harms for folks in both the short term and the long term.
That was Metro senior producer David Lyons speaking with Bharat Ramamurti, senior advisor for economic strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project and a former advisor for the Biden-Harris administration. Here at WDET, our newsroom and the Metro are keeping a close eye on President Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Russ McNamara recently spoke with economist Jim Stanford. He's director of the Vancouver-based Center for the Future of Work. Russ started by asking Stanford if tariffs will make high prices of goods go down for Americans, which was one of President Trump's campaign promises.
They go in exactly the opposite direction, Russ. There's no doubt that these tariffs, which will be paid by Americans, it isn't Canadians and Mexicans who pay it, it's Americans, will absolutely add to the prices of anything that's imported from the affected countries, from groceries to energy to vehicles. So get ready for higher prices.
Yeah, I was afraid of that. We're in Detroit. Michigan's economy is tied tightly to Canada's, and more specifically Ontario's. What are the short and long-term impacts likely to be for Canadians in this deal?
Well, Canadians are going to hurt, as are Americans, really, on both sides of the border. All the trade that goes back and forth, particularly in the auto industry, but in any other manufacturing operation, you're getting parts, you're getting components, you're getting semi-finished goods, you're getting steel. You're getting everything else. In the auto sector, you're getting engines and transmissions going back and forth. So it really is hard to tell where the final product was made. The whole idea that a car was made in the U.S. or made in Canada or made in Mexico doesn't really work in North America anymore because it's made in all three countries, basically. So what's going to happen with this tariff, which really, Russ, could be applied, we don't know yet, it could be applied at each crossing. You could pay a 25% tariff on the steel and then a 25% tariff when the steel comes back in a semi-finished product, and then another 25% tariff when it's fashioned into a transmission or something, and then another 25% tariff when the finished vehicle crosses the border. Add all that up, and it's going to be a catastrophe for the auto industry. They have had an integrated supply chain across the border for 60 years, dating back to the Auto Pact of the 1960s. So we're in uncharted territory here, but there's no doubt that Canadian manufacturing workers and anyone else who's product is sold in the U.S. Is standing on the abyss right now.
Yeah, and how quickly could that abyss get here? I mean, are we talking like full work stoppages almost immediately?
It depends on how the companies involved respond. If, in fact, they just say, well, we're going to swallow the 25% tariff and see what happens, maybe in hopes that a negotiated arrangement can be reached. But it sure didn't sound like that listening to Mr. Trump over the weekend. Perhaps it could carry on for a while and then the industry just takes these extra costs and passes them on to the consumer. I think the bigger issue will be what if some suppliers say, I cannot do it, and actually just stop supplying. And the auto industry is very finely tuned machine, just-in-time deliveries of all kinds of components. So it doesn't take a whole lot to end up shutting down assembly plants. And again, that would occur on both sides of the border. The American auto industry is as fragile with respect to these tariffs as is Canada's and Mexico's. In the long run, Mr. Trump's hope is that all the companies will just move all of their operations to the United States. Whether that makes sense or not remains to be seen. And at any rate, it would take years to accomplish that. So I think, again, everyone in North America is in for some significant pain as a result of this. Yeah,
and admittedly, this is more of a policy and political question, but how do these tariffs change the mindset for Canadian industries moving forward? Even if they're quickly repealed, does this change their mindset or strategy, or are they just kind of stuck with us, and us being the U.S.?
I think that's a really important point, Russ. Even if Mr. Trump changed his mind tomorrow and said, okay, I was just using this as leverage to, try and get some concessions on other issues, defense spending, et cetera, it would still be a permanent change in the outlook of business of any nationality towards where they're going to locate their facilities. And whether it was a Canadian company or, of course, in Canada, we've got a lot of American companies that have set up here to take advantage of the labor, the cost advantages in some areas, the critical minerals and so on that we've got. Companies of any nationality will say, hey, I don't know if it makes sense. I don't know what Mr. Trump's going to do next. So I'm not going to put something in Canada or in Mexico. And that, frankly, is probably Mr. Trump's goal here. But the reality is, it's going to be chaos on both sides of the border for a considerable period of time. One important thing to keep in mind is that there's a big difference between what America buys from Canada and what it buys from another country like China, for example. Very little of what comes in from Canada is a finished product that would then show up on the shelves at Costco or somewhere else like that. What is mostly bought, about 3/4 of America's imports from Canada, are inputs to U.S. businesses. Everything from energy and minerals to lumber, agricultural commodities, to industrial materials, steel, auto parts. And these are things used by American businesses. They're not purchased off the shelf by consumers. So the whole idea that if we shift the tariff decision and then American consumers will buy American instead of buying Canadian doesn't really apply here. It's actually American businesses that are going to feel the pinch first. And that, again, just is what makes it so puzzling that the U.S. government would do this.
That was WDET's All Things Considered host, Russ McNamara, speaking with Jim Stanford, director of Vancouver-based Center for the Future of Work. And tomorrow we'll focus on how the newly announced tariffs will impact the auto industries and regional economies in Michigan and Ontario.
Coming up at 11, it's Fat Tuesday, and Ramadan started on Friday evening. These traditions are very different, but there is one thing they have in common.
What is that, Robin?
It's food. In the next hour, we'll talk about the cuisines that are relevant to these holidays. This is a favorite subject of both you and me.
Yes, it is.
And we also want to hear from you. Call in and tell us, what's your favorite food tradition? The number is 313-577-1019.
And up next, speaking of food, the earliest known cookbook authored and published by a Black woman came from Southwest Michigan during the Civil War era. We'll hear the story behind it all. That's coming up next on The Metro.